kind of learn how to build. This was kind of my first Photoshop extension for CC. And so I've done a lot of extensions that you guys have seen from some of my other posts as far as like Outlook extensions and Sketch and so forth. And so like this was the first time I did one for Photoshop, and luckily everything is using JavaScript behind the scenes. So building extensions, really just kind of learning, the syntax and how to deploy it and so forth, but it's all JavaScript, so it's actually pretty easy to develop for once you kind of learn the language and the documentation. And I'll actually post a link to the Photoshop scripting documentation below this so you can have access to it. And so what I did quickly is I built this extension for some commonly used functions that our photo studio will do to make sure images are the right sizes and kind of post-processing. And so you'll see over here to my right is kind of my new extension, my little panel, and there's a bunch of user inputs so they can actually put in specific ranges and numbers because it varies from person to person based on what they're doing. You can run it on all the open documents or just the active document, and then there's a few other functions that I'll show you. And so I'm going to actually run this real quick. And so what it's going to do is it's going to go through, and first it's going to trim these images. And so what that means is it's removing all the white space from the image, and then after it trims it, it has a new size, height, and resolution. And based on that new height and resolution, it's actually looking at these ranges to figure out what to do with it next. And so this image was pretty large, and so it actually downsized its longest edge to 2500 pixels. This one was a square. It was within the range of 916, and so it made its longest edge 1600. And then this one I think was bigger than 2500, it was portrait, and so forth. So it's going through and automating all that for our photo studio team and making their job a lot easier. So let me actually close this. So that's one kind of function. And that's a primary thing that they do. The other thing, which was kind of a nice to have, but I actually figured out a way to do it, is they actually create these swatches from these kind of files. So it's swatch is basically a round cutout that they use on the website. And so I have this function create swatches from smooches. I'm going to run it. You'll see the progress indicator. So it's actually going to go through each of the open files, and then you'll see what it spits out. So once it's done, run. And so you'll see all of these are now this kind of masked, clipping mask file saved over it. So it's the same file extension, and then they can come in here and quickly make their swatches and saves them a lot of time. Go back to Ultimate Photo Studio, and so yeah, it was very complicated to actually code it, but once I figured out how to do it, works really fast and it works really well. So let me actually dismiss these. And then another function was quickly fetching images. So I have this get images from SKU, so you can paste in a bunch of SKUs here, hit run, and then you'll see on my desktop all these images pop in. So I'll grab these four, and so they can quickly grab these images and manipulate them. So those are kind of three functions that my tool is quickly doing right now, and I think I'm going to elaborate on it more in the future. But yeah, that's quickly what it does. And then so I figured I'll give you a quick overview of kind of how the code works. And so it's kind of divided into three primary things. And so the first thing is like the client, which we can define as like the index HTML. So it's actually responsible for most of the markup, the inputs, all that. And then you have the index.js JavaScript, which is assigning all the functions and kind of binding events to our user interface element, and then passing it to the host index.jsx, which is actually responsible for running within Photoshop and actually the Photoshop scripting piece of it. So essentially think of this index.js as then calling this index.jsx and telling it what to do. So if you go deeper on here, these are some functions that are tied to a add event listener and click, and then it's ultimately calling this CS interface evaluate script resize document. And so if you were to go at index.jsx, you'd see a resize document function with a couple input parameters. And so that's how it's passing information from the index.js to the index.jss. And so those three files in combination with this manifest XML are primarily all you need to create an extension. And so those are the most important things. There's also the CS interface.js that it uses as a dependency, so you want to make sure you import that. And then the last thing that I learned quickly for those, if you're going to do this is you're going to want to put it in a specific folder. So say you're testing locally, you want to go to Library, Application Support, Adobe, CEP extensions, and this is where I've dropped that folder. And then it'll start showing up in Photoshop. And then one last thing you want to do is you're going to want to run I thought I had it in my paste board. You're going to want a script to actually put it in debug mode. So if you Google that, it's pretty easy to find terminal command to allow you to run unsigned extensions in Photoshop. Now I'm actually deploying this just here internally in Alta, so I'm only going to use it in that mode. I'm not going to actually put it in Adobe's store because I don't want this to be public. So on their computer I've had to run that terminal command to make sure that it's in development mode so they can run a unsigned extension in Photoshop. Now I might actually look into signing it and seeing if there's another way that doesn't involve putting it in Adobe Store, but this was kind of the best way to do it. So yeah, if you have any questions, please reach out. I will put a link to the documentation below the video. Thank you.